and what efforts exist in our local community and in other areas in terms of wildfire survivability in our built environment. So in this discussion, we are going to hear from some local and national wildfire professionals and researchers on the multiple factors that influence home survivability in wildland urban environments, and also innovative engineering and policy opportunities that we can all consider. So I would like to acknowledge that we in the Boulder Creek watershed, which many of us probably are in right now, is on lands, encompasses lands within the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples' territories. And we benefit from those stolen lands and the forced removal of these tribes. And particularly surrounding this topic and climate change, I think there's a lot of learning that we can do and integrating Indigenous perspectives on land stewardship. So a few housekeeping things, please. This is just a regular Zoom call, so please keep yourself muted while everyone's presenting. We will have time for question and answers at the end of the presentation, but if you want to go ahead and put questions in the chat as we go along, so you remember, or so people can respond to it while we're moving through this, please go ahead and do that. And at the end, there is a hand raising feature for the Q&A that is down at the bottom of your screen in the reactions section, so you can use that. And if you want to see just the presenters as we go through this instead of all the little black boxes, you can click the 3 dots in the upper right hand corner and select the speaker view. And I also wanted to just give a huge thank you to Erin Freed, who works for us, the Boulder Watershed Collective, for all of her efforts putting this webinar together and the whole Living with Wildfire learning series that we've been doing. So we have some awesome presenters here tonight. I'm going to give a short introduction to each of them, but you all please feel free to introduce yourselves further at the beginning of your presentations if you'd like to. So first we have Jim Webster, who is the program coordinator for Wildfire Partners. And he and his team provide education on how to mitigate homes against the threat of wildfires and help mountain and foothills homeowners in Boulder County better protect their properties. And we also have Dr. Erica Fisher. She's an assistant professor of civil and construction engineering at Oregon State University. And her research revolves around innovative approaches to improve the resilience and robustness of structural systems affected by natural and man-made hazards. And we also have Dr. Michaela Barbato. I think I pronounced that wrong again, so you're gonna have to correct me again. He's the professor of civil and environmental engineering at UC Davis. And he's interested in the modeling, analysis, and design of structures subject to single and multiple hazards, including wildfires. And his research efforts lead to new designs and structures that are sustainable, economic, and safe, and increase community resilience to single and multiple hazards. And we also have, last but not least, Kelly Johnston is with the Community Wildfire Planning Center, which is a nonprofit dedicated to helping communities prepare for, adapt to, and recover from wildfires. And Kelly focuses his expertise in community wildfire risk assessment, wildland urban interface mitigation solutions, fire behavior analysis, prescribed fire, and fire ecology. So a really vast array of information and expertise here today. Okay, Jim, if you would like to share your screen, we'll go ahead and get started.
Good, thanks for that introduction, Maya. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm just sharing screen. We've got some hidden icons here, and I'll get to it in just a second.
Are you trying to make it big?
Yeah, I'm trying to make it big here.
I think right up on the upper left hand, like in the orange bar, is it?
Yeah, that's what I understand. I just can't see that right now. So.
Oh.
I get it. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. So again, I work for Boulder County, and we had our first wildland urban interface fire in 1989, the Black Tiger Fire, where we lost 44 homes. And since that time, we've been doing a great deal of mitigation. So we have thousands of residents spending millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of hours mitigating. We have regulations through our building and land use code for new construction, for additions, for decks, for short-term rental licenses. We have voluntary programs. So a lot of work has been taking place over the last 30 years to prepare for wildfires. However, let me say, our focus since 1989 has been in the foothills and mountains of Western Boulder County. So our services, our programs, our regulations have been focused on this area, and a great deal of work is taking place. We have not been active on the plains, or what you see here is fire zone number 2. So post Marshall Fire, we are thinking and trying to figure out how we bring our expertise and our experience from the foothills and the mountains into the plains. So today we're going to talk, a little bit about our programs and some of our lessons, and maybe some thoughts for the future, and really looking forward to some question and answers about our programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about our programs in those foothills and the mountains. If you reside in the foothills and mountains, we have programs available for you. You might have heard of Wildfire Partners. That's our current program. We have a website, wildfirepartners.org. It's a home certification program that we launched in 2014 following the 4 Mile Fire, and been engaged in offering a number of services through Wildfire Partners. And we've really stopped doing presentations like this to large groups, because in Wildfire Partners, we provide one-on-one home assessments where a mitigation specialist comes and provides an assessment of the individual property and education to that homeowner. So it's a 2 to 4 hour assessment. We'll go through it. We provide financial assistance, that's technical assistance, a great deal of support, includes a certification process. So we have programs in place. So we don't have to necessarily rely on the website, the brochure, the video, the webinar, because we provide that on-site education and assistance, and it's proven very effective. I'm not going to go through the whole home assessment in this presentation. We've got 10 categories. We have about 50 questions. This home assessment looks at all the vulnerabilities of a property, and again, takes several hours. We've completed over 2,800 assessments and over 1,200 certifications. The people that have gone and completed their checklist and their items from their customized report. So this program allows us to give that one-on-one customized assistance instead of sort of a generic presentation or a website or a video. And that's what we found is really valuable, that people really value that. We take pictures like you see here of the things that need to be corrected. And so this program is something we have, but it's just in the foothills and mountains. And it really has led to an enormous amount of activity in these communities to harden their structures, to create defensible space, and really the homeowners going out and actively managing their property. Some of the lots of good lessons that we've been learning over the last 9 years, and really over the last 30 years of working with homeowners day in, day out, all year round to prepare for wildfire. But sort of a question now, post-Marshall Fire, is what do we do on the plains in this wildfire management zone 2? And this, of course, includes both unincorporated areas. I represent Boulder County, so that's sort of my area of focus, but we also have a number of municipalities, the city of Boulder, Longmont, Louisville, Superior, Lafayette, Erie. So currently, we don't have programs, we don't have capacity, we don't have assistance like the Wildfire Partners program, where someone can come and provide that on-site assessment with a customized report with that follow-up. Some of you in Boulder County might be familiar with Energy Smart. Wildfire Partners was sort of modeled after Energy Smart, where you have an energy audit and that assistance to become more energy efficient. We have this program. but it's currently only available in the mountains. So how do we provide that assistance to folks on the plains? Well, this is a start, right? Providing webinars, providing some information. So we're going around and giving, talks and speeches. We don't right now have the capacity to do those on-site assessments, but that's something we're looking into, and will be interesting discussion. And it's different. The wildfire mitigation that we've been doing for 30 years in the mountains, we're familiar with that geography, but working on the plains presents some new challenges, some new opportunities too. So I'm going to go through a few things that we talk about in Wildfire Partners. Again, with my limited time, I can't go into everything, but we'll talk about a few things here. But just one reminder, this is an ember blizzard. We actually lose more homes from embers. A lot of people think of direct flames or radiant heat, that flame, but embers can travel great distances, more than a mile, and they want to ignite most homes. So a lot of our mitigation measures, when we think, you have to think like an ember, think about these ember blizzards and how we protect homes from this vulnerability. So it's a good shot here of what an ember blizzard looks like. And this is one of the things we're trying to mitigate when we're trying to harden homes, create defensible space, and prepare people for evacuation and things like under insurance. We look at, I said, the 10 different categories. I'm not going to go through every of the 50 questions, but we start with the roof. Roof is very vulnerable. A lot of those embers are going to land on the roof. So if you have a shake shingle roof, we talk about replacing that. And that in Boulder, both the city and the county have had initiatives of that for many years. But that's part of the assessment. You can see here there are vulnerabilities on the roof where siding meets and roofing types, where things like pine needles can ignite. And so these are places where we harden structures. So here's an example where, here on the left, when you have the siding coming up the roof, there are vulnerabilities. If embers land in this location and there's pine needles, this will lead to ignition. So putting flashing in these vulnerable areas is part of our home hardening, home retrofit mitigation measures. And we go through and look at all the vulnerabilities on the roof and across the structure. Another quick example of gutters. Example here of a vinyl gutter melting and peeling off. So having a good gutter, and then the maintenance of the gutter. You see here, maintenance is a big part of wildfire mitigation. We talk some here about the home hardening defensible space, but it's not a one-time event, right? We do some initial mitigation, but something that's done annually or monthly. Things like mowing grasses or weed whacking or cleaning out pine needles out of gutters takes place on a regular basis. So the idea with the action plan is identifying all the vulnerabilities, understanding how home ignites, and then replacing, in this case, the vinyl gutters and maintaining this on a regular basis. So we go through, this is part of the mitigation process. Some of the tasks are simple. We talk about cutting grass or cleaning out the gutter is simple, but some of it gets pretty complex. And that's where we bring in the wildfire mitigation specialists with their expertise, so people can work smarter, not harder, in understanding what that mitigation needs to be. So some of the tasks are simple, but understanding some of them require some technical assistance. So that's what we provide with Wildfire Partners on the mountains and plains, but right now don't have the capacity to really do on the plains. So there's a lot of the home hardening. We usually start with the home, and that's where mitigation begins. So I'm going to jump through in the interest of time and talk a little bit about defensible space as well. This is a second aspect of mitigation and assessments, is creating defensible space around your structures. And the picture on the right is a little older. It shows these zones. It's labeled as zone 1, 0 to 30 feet. So the first 30 feet has a prescription. And then the second zone here is listed as 30 to 75, 70 feet. So it goes from 30 to 100 feet. So you'll see these zones. On the left, you see an initial zone added, the 0 to 5 feet. That has a number of different names since it was added at the time. Some people call it zone 0, some people call it zone 1, and have switched the numbers. But the 0 to 5 feet we've added because that's really important when it comes to embers. And I showed that picture of embers because that first 5 feet around the home is where embers can accumulate. When it's really windy and those embers blow up against the structure, they'll accumulate at base of walls. So there's a different zone of 0 to 5 feet where we have prescriptions as well. So you'll hear people talking about defensible space zones. And so those are 3 of the basic zones there, 0 to 5, 5 to 30, and 30 to 100. We do extend that third zone, or the 30 to 100 feet, to up to 200 feet, especially when there's a steep slope. But this is a basic, some of the basic information on defensible space zones. And you can understand some potential challenges on the plains. Here's a picture of a 5-acre lot with the red line being the zone, the 30-foot marker, and the yellow line being the 100-foot zone. So you can see on this property, 5 acres, most people with 5 acres can fit their entire defensible space zones on their own property, unless their structure is right up against their boundary. And so in this case, when you have these zones on your own property, you have the ability to reduce your risk through these actions on your defensible space, through mitigating and reducing thinning trees, removing surface fuels, and other things with accessory structures in these areas. So you can see the strategies here on a 5-acre lot, in terms of their plan, are going to be removing some trees, and they have control over this defensible space. Here's a picture of a home on the plains with a 1/3 of an acre lot. And so you can see the first 30 feet defensible space zone in red here extends onto their neighbor's property. And then the 100-foot zone in yellow, includes some houses on their neighboring property. And I think we all understand, or if you don't, when we talk about fuel, people typically think of trees, but homes are also fuel. So when you have trees on your own property in your zone, you're able to remove them. But in terms of this configuration, it's not like you can go across your boundary and impact all the fuel on your neighboring property. So it requires some different strategies, and you're not able, in this case, this homeowner in this 1/3 of an acre lot is not able to create a full defensible space. So their ability, they can still harden their home and they can still take some action, but it means working with neighbors and a little bit different strategy than larger acre lots. So that's one of the challenges when we get into a suburban or urban setting with the traditional defensible space markings, is oftentimes people don't have control of their full defensible space on their own property. So that engages working with neighbors. And then often the biggest threat is if a neighbor's home ignites and it's very close to a property, there's an increased chance of that igniting the neighboring structure. So that's a key factor that's different in different communities with different densities or different structure separation distance. So one of the factors in looking at mitigating your property is measuring the distances between your structure and neighboring structures, or even accessory structures are also fuel, of course. So that's one of the factors that's important in terms of mitigation and understanding that risk. And here's just a little bit of a blowout. This is a community here. You can sort of see this is at the center. And with embers, even some of the homes in the center are at risk, right? Because those embers can travel a great distance. The homes on the border, or maybe bordering open space, their ability to do mitigation is really important for the whole community. But looking at this community as a plan instead of just each individual structure is something we need to do on the plains, is working collectively in communities like this. So slightly different strategies based on densities. Talking about I'll just talk a little bit about that first 0 to 5 feet, the non-combustible zone, removing vegetation, fuel up against houses. That combustible mulch right up against your house is where the embers are going to land. That mulch ignites and ignites the home. So we're creating non-combustible surfaces and removing vegetation from that first 0 to 5 feet. This is a pretty fancy example of that 0 to 5 feet space with some nice landscaping. Here's a little bit more basic example. This is the Calwood fire that burned right up to this home, and the home survived. It had good hardening, Wildfire Partners certified home. You can see this sort of 0 to 5 feet with gravel. We have people put down a weed barrier and gravel in that first 5 feet, and that's really important for reducing that ignition potential of that home. Fences. People in the Marshall Fire and other people have heard about fencing. Fencing can be a big risk, carrying like a wick fire from backyards up to homes. So if you have your fence that is attached to your structure, that's an increased risk. So what we do is mitigate that first 5 feet by having a non-combustible fence, metal or other material, in that 5 feet. So it serves the same purpose of that 5 feet non-combustible barrier, so that home, the fire doesn't directly contact the structure. So these are just a few examples Again, in 10 minutes, I can't go through a complete checklist. There are lots of resources online, literature, websites, videos, and of course, on-site technical assistance is the best to really understand and look at all your vulnerabilities. This is just sort of a, not the best way to communicate, but just giving you some ideas of some of the mitigation measures that we take. A lot of people think about trees and combustible mulch and some other things, but there's a lot of debris or what some people call junk. And this is a real increased vulnerability when you stack lumber up against structures. And this is where embers will lodge and pine needles will lodge, and this will ignite. So a lot of it, if you're a hoarder, unfortunately, that's going to be a challenge for you to sort of clean up that property and reduce your wildfire risk, because things stacked underneath decks or up against structures is creating great vulnerabilities. And of course, there's a long list of things from RVs to pergolas to play sets, ignition ignitable things that we look at on every property. And so here's an example of this mitigated shed where they've removed that material and they've done that same non-combustible barrier around that accessory structure, because we don't want this accessory structure to ignite because it's so close to the home. So we're going to mitigate that accessory structure as well. And some just other pictures in this first 0 to 5 feet, windows are vulnerable, so we want to make sure to clear vegetation away from the window, and if there's combustible mulch, to remove those. And so an after picture is what you'll see in that first 5 feet. Really important to clean that out, because this is a highly vulnerable place. And this, most people do have at least 5 feet within their property lines. I'm not going to talk about the entire assessment and go through all the vulnerabilities, but just wanted to give you a quick flavor of some of the things that are involved in mitigation, whether it's hardening the structure or creating defensible space. And so, it's just a couple other points that we look at in terms of our program with Wildfire Partners. We not only work with homeowners to harden their structure and create defensible space, but we talked about the problem of underinsurance, creating a home inventory, the emergency preparedness piece of evacuation planning, to-go kits, getting a plan for your pets. And so each individual needs to prepare and get ready for wildfire. And that's just not mitigating the structure and defensible space. It's receiving notifications and knowing how to evacuate, evacuation routes. And then, of course, it's really important to work with neighbors, especially in those more dense communities. So working with your neighbor and coordinating your mitigation efforts to reduce fuels, and then work at a community level as well. So here's a picture of a home in the Cold Springs fire that survived. Fire burned right through the property. Neighboring homes were lost. This was built with ignition-resistant construction with building code requirements. And so we have successes. We have examples of where homes survive because of good mitigation, and they might be standalone, but that mitigation might also allow firefighters to come and help protect that structure. So there's lots of benefits of the mitigation work. Right now, the challenge is really to bring the capacity to new areas, to the plains. So, lots going on in Boulder County over the years in the foothills and mountains, but our new era here, we have climate-driven wildfires that are going to increase, and we need to prepare for the future. And so we need to build programs for the plains. And we've got a lot of experience in the mountains to bring to bear, and we're putting together a pilot program for this year to bring to the plains to learn and to test that. But to work with all the municipalities and the large number of people in the plains, it's going to take a while. And political support from leadership, funding, support from community that wants this assistance will also ultimately depend on what happens. But we're committed to growing wildfire preparedness and mitigation programs and working really with community members. I mean, that's the idea of Wildfire Partners. We've got over 40 partners, including insurance companies, realtors, local hardware stores, the fire districts, Fed, state, lots of partners, lots of support throughout the country and the community. So we're looking to build upon what we've done in the foothills and mountains in the future, and start offering some services to folks in the plains. But it's going to take some time because this Marshall Fire is a transition. And so I'm really interested in hearing questions from people and listening to the other presenters and talking more about our future of reducing wildfire risk. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. All right, Erica Fisher is going to talk to us next.
All right. Thank you, Jim, so much for that great presentation. Hopefully I can build off of it, talking about wildfire impacts on housing. And I'm going to talk about it a bit through building off of what Jim has said, but also through data collected after the 2021 Marshall Fire. My name is Erica Fisher. I'm an assistant professor at Oregon State University. I'm a structural engineering professor. I've worked with communities after wildfires in California and Oregon, and now in Colorado. So all the work that I'm presenting here is a collaborative effort with professors at CU Boulder and funded under the National Science Foundation. So to build right off of what Jim was saying, we didn't even talk beforehand, and it really seamlessly transitioned. So this is a picture right out of NFPA's FireWise program. And so, if we have our home here, our goal is to reduce home susceptibility to wildfires and also to reduce the exposure of the home to the wildfires. So that needs to occur through both direct flame contact by flames approaching the home, and also through embers, as Jim was saying before. So, our reduction of this defense of the fuels leading up to the home is really going to reduce the fire from approaching the home directly through direct flame contact, but also reduce the distance, increase the distance that our embers have to fly in order to hit the home itself, and reduce any combustible material that could be close to the home that embers could fly and hit and ignite. So I always kind of joke that we learned the combustion triangle back in elementary school, and then we kind of forget about it. But you need fuels in order to have a fire, and if you can reduce your fuels, then you can reduce the intensity of your fires and the susceptibility of your home exposure to those fires. And the fuels, again, it's like these shrubs and small trees. It's not going to be that 200-year-old oak tree that's in your front yard. It's going to be more combustible materials that are closer to your home. And so I love this flow chart. There's a lot of words on the page, but really what it comes down to, it's what I love about it is it shows it's not just on the owners of the homeowners. We really need to be working collaboratively with our local governments and our land management agencies to really accomplish this, because we have to simultaneously reduce the exposure of our homes to wildfires while also reducing the susceptibility of our home to wildfires. So increasing our home resistance to that ignition while also simultaneously reducing the exposure. So I think it's more than just one entity that's going to accomplish this. We all have to work together. So what am I going to talk about specifically today is really data that we collected after the 2021 Marshall Fire. And I don't need to tell the people on this call, as you know, the fire started on December 30th and approached the towns of Louisville, Superior, unincorporated Boulder County very quickly and ripped through the towns, destroying over 1,000 homes and damaging hundreds of others. This is just a drone footage of one of the areas within Louisville that we took when we were collecting data. Okay, so we saw that what's different about this community and why we decided to study this community was that we saw a lot of modern homes. We saw homes that were more closely spaced together. This is more of what we call an interface community, a community that interfaces with the wildland, rather than many of the more wildland urban interface communities that we have out where I am in Oregon, where we have a lot of intermixed communities where we're really looking at the homes that are interspersed within the wildland itself. So to build off of what Jim was saying about the fire in the plains, here's Boulder right here. I realize it's really small and hard to read, but these are the previous large fires in Colorado and specifically in Boulder County. That's what this black outline is. You can see the Marshall Fire is east of Boulder, and there aren't many other fires east of Boulder, if at all. So this is really why this fire is interesting from a fire dynamic standpoint, from a fire science standpoint, and then from the community standpoint, it's interesting because we're dealing with a more modern community, homes closely spaced together, and we're dealing with a WUI community. So while, yes, this is a kind of a unique circumstance for Colorado, we have these types of communities all over the United States and all over the Western United States where we're having wildfires. So studying this fire is really interesting from a scientific standpoint, because we really haven't studied these interface communities quite so much as we studied these intermixed communities. So one of our goals, we had many goals of our research, but what I'll only cover today is we really wanted to understand the characteristics of housing that influence survivability. So we saw in that drone footage there that we saw, you know, a bunch of homes that were completely destroyed, but then we also saw homes that were standing. And so we were asking ourselves why were some standing and why were some not standing? And are there specific characteristics of those homes that influence survivability so that we can learn from these communities and apply it to other communities across the United States? Okay, so this is just a breakdown of the homes that were destroyed and damaged in all the impacted areas, as well as the approximated value of the residential damage. So in total, we saw about 7% of the homes in Louisville, 7% of the homes in Superior were damaged or destroyed, rather. So not a very large percentage, but it is a good chunk of homes that were damaged or that were destroyed. It's going to impact the communities greatly in their recovery. So we collected data using 3 different methods. So we surveyed the homes on the ground. We flew drones, and we're actually still flying drones this week in Colorado to gather some additional data. So we went to over 200 homes throughout the 3 different areas. We flew drones over 14 different neighborhoods. And then we also have tax records, permit data, and Zillow data for many of these homes as well. Okay, so if we look at the spatial distribution of these homes, the fire started over here in Marshall, we can see again the homes are clustered together. The red dots are the destroyed homes and the blue dots are the damaged homes. So we see the clusters of homes, and you know, with the homes being close together, that, you know, it's not surprising that we see it this way. But again, we want to know, well, what happens, you know, at the borders of these clusters, or what happens at the borders of the clusters of red moving into blue? Why do we see all these clusters of red homes versus blue homes? So for today, because I don't have a ton of time, I'm only going to focus on the homes in Louisville. And so what we looked at when we looked at characteristics is we looked at a number of different home characteristics that are specific to the home. So presence of fences, just as Jim mentioned before. We looked at size of the homes, previous improvements, year built, material. But we also looked at location of the home, proximity of the home to another home, and also proximity of that home to vegetation. How close were trees or combustible vegetation near the home? We looked at topology. Fire is very influenced by topology, by slopes. And we also, many of these homes were bordering open spaces within Louisville particularly. And lastly, we looked at firefighting efforts, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but you know, we do need to appreciate the effort that firefighters took during this fire, and the success of their efforts in preventing the fire from spreading further throughout many of these communities. Okay, so again, I'm going to focus on Louisville today. So what we're looking at here is a map of Louisville. Here's the open space, and here's the rec center right here. Here's also an open space, and there's 3 neighborhoods here, and we kind of divided them up even more. So this is Cherrywood Lane. Here's Mulberry. Then we have Vista Lane, and then we have these 2 cul-de-sacs. Crestview and in Skyview Court. Then we have South Tanager Court and South Warbler Court. Another neighborhood we surveyed in Louisville that I'll include in the data I'm presenting today is over by the hospital in that St. Andrews area. And that's a little bit further away from this map, so it's not shown on the map itself. So if we focus on our first characteristic, so distance between neighboring homes, this has actually gotten a lot of attention in the news. That the distance between homes was really, really close, particularly in Louisville and in the areas that were impacted. And actually what we saw is we didn't actually see that the homes were unusually spaced close together. We saw it on average, the distance between the homes was about 18.5 feet, which is not that close together actually. You know, and the distance between the homes, the reason, you know, we focus on this is really for fire spread between the homes is the more obvious reason. If one home is on fire and the next home is not, we will if the distance is really close, then the fire can spread through direct flame contact. If the homes are spaced further away, you need actually radiative heat transfer in order to transfer the fire from one entity to the next. And as you increase that distance more and more, you're actually not going to combust the other house just because one house is on fire. Another reason that we focus on distance between homes is for firefighters, for them to get between the house. And if this house is on fire on the left and the house is on the right is not on fire, is it safe for them to get between the homes and actually fight the fire in that pathway between the homes? If it's not, then because the homes are spaced too closely together, then it impacts their firefighting methodologies. Okay. So the next characteristic was these fences, and we saw them absolutely everywhere. And I realize there's a lot of patterns on the screen right now, but what I want you to take away from this is that a significant number of the homes had fences. Actually, 96% of the homes in Louisville that we surveyed had fences. 100% of those homes with fences were wooden fences, and 100% of those homes that had fences actually had fences that touched the home. So if the fire catches the fence because it's bordering open space or a yard, and then it's touching the home, now all of a sudden we have direct flame contact to the house, and we can actually combust the house itself. Other home characteristics that we saw were really prevalent were these decks. A lot of the homes had decks. Actually, 64% of the homes we surveyed in Louisville had decks attached to them, and the vast majority of them were wooden decks. So again, combustible material attached to the house itself, just as Jim was showing those backyards, and the mitigation that occurred to remove that combustible material. So some kind of summaries here, because they don't have much more time, but actually 100% of the homes that we surveyed in Louisville were constructed out of wood. The average year that they were built was in 1991, which is actually a pretty modern home. I know it's almost 30 years ago, but we do consider that a modern home. Only 1% of these homes had siding repairs in the last 10 years. Newer siding tends to be less combustible. So this is why we were looking at these permit records to see when they actually had these repairs. 96% of the homes we surveyed had fences, with 100% of them being wooden fences and 100% of them being touching the home itself. The average house size was actually quite large as compared to the U.S. average house size, so over 2,000 square feet, and 64% of them had decks. We saw the homes they're closely spaced, but nothing out of the ordinary. We didn't think this was as alarming as it was. A lot of it was in the media, so we actually crunched this data really quickly because we were really interested in seeing what was coming up. It is more closely spaced than we've seen in WUI communities in the past, but again, we've seen those WUI communities as intermixed communities, so they're in the middle of the wildland, they're in the middle of the forest. The homes are going to be spaced further apart. More importantly, I think, than distance between the homes is that we saw 97% of the homes we surveyed had trees within 5 feet of the house, and 97% of the homes had shrubbery or bushes within 5 feet of the house. So if we really want to talk about, what is combusting these homes and proximity of combustible materials to those homes, I think these are a bigger deal than the distance between the homes. And then lastly, 33%, so a third of the homes that we surveyed in Louisville bordered open spaces, and these open spaces did have prescribed burns planned for this spring, but the fire occurred before the spring actually came about. So thinking about where the home is in proximity to these open spaces with a lot of fuel is also important. So just quickly looking at fire characteristics, something that we decided to do is start looking at, evidence of extreme heat. Concrete can tell you a lot, tells a good story about extreme heat. Concrete changes color when it is heated to temperatures above around 600 degrees Celsius. And concrete actually spalls, like I'm showing in these two pictures on the right, when it's heated to temperatures above 300 degrees Celsius. So these characteristics indicate that there was extreme heat and a lot of intensity of burning. Homes burn with about 10 times more energy than vegetation. So this is another reason we really don't want our homes to burn, because we're releasing a lot of heat. They're burning for significant periods of time. We're looking at hours, creating embers and just sitting there and potentially causing the fire spread throughout the community. So we're able to use these indications to try to figure out what the temperatures were at a lot of these homes. You can see there's a lot more bars on the higher end of that. And so we saw very, very high heat and very high temperatures of exposure for the foundations of these homes, indicating it was a very intense fire that came through this community. Just wrapping up here, as just some summary of our preliminary findings, we did see some closely spaced houses, but more importantly, we saw this high intensity of heat. We saw proximity to open spaces, fences touching the house. We saw proximity to our vegetation as well. And so if we kind of go back to our reducing risk to our home loss, right? We want to reduce the susceptibility of our homes to wildfire loss. So that's thinking about our fences, our decks, our vegetation, while simultaneously reducing the exposure, the treatments in the wildland itself, and treating our open spaces. I just want to acknowledge the larger team and support that we got from our local municipalities. We really appreciated it in order to collect all this data. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Erica. So much information there. Really looking forward to seeing, the final outcomes of all your research too. Okay, now we're gonna move on to Michaela. Michaela Barbato, you can share your screen
If I
here.
can share my screen. Is it visible?
Yep.
Oh, great. So thank you again for this opportunity to talk about some of the work that we are doing at UC Davis, kind of taking a different approach to the same issue of defending our built environment from wildfires. We are focused a little bit more on new buildings, new houses, and what we can do for the future. Obviously, there is a lot of work to be done for existing houses, for the hardening, but we are also looking at the future, and should we really keep building the houses in the way we are building them now if they're going into flame every time there is a wildfire? And so we are working on developing technologies for affordable and sustainable wildfire-resistant housing. And the techniques that we are using are based on using earth construction. I'm Michele Barbato, a professor of structural engineering in the Civil Environmental Engineering Department at UC Davis, and also co-director of the UC Davis Climate Adaptation Research Center and director of the Climate Initiative for the CITRIS and the Banatao Institute, which is a multi-campus institute in the UC system that includes UC Davis, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Merced. So the earthen construction is really a very ancient technology that has been lost in the last few centuries. But these are houses that are built mainly using local soil, very natural materials. We have been using this technology for more than 10,000 years. So it's kind of proven. And still about 30 to 50% of the world population lives in earth-based dwellings. You can find earthen structures all over the world. There are some very famous ones. An example is the Great Wall of China, or the Pueblo do Taos here in New Mexico, USA, but there are construction in Southern America, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe. So it's a technology that has been around for very long, very successfully. It's just that we are not using it anymore as we did in the past. Just to give an idea, there are historical methods of building with soil. There is cob, fundamentally layers of clay that are used and layered to produce walls, or rammed earth, like the one that is used for the Great Wall of China, where forms are used to compact soil into walls. Adobe probably is the most famous one, where bricks are made using clay. And then there are more modern versions of fundamentally Adobe that are modern earth blocks using mechanical compression for generating blocks, or chemical stabilization for making blocks, or the most modern approach that is combining mechanical compression and chemical stabilization in order to get high strength and high durability to any type of environmental conditions. You can see there are historical examples here, but also modern constructions, very recent constructions that have survived the effect of time in a very good manner. So why are we looking back at earthen construction? First of all, it is a very affordable and locally appropriate technology. Soil is widely available and is inexpensive. Fundamentally, you need the shovel and you can build with what you have under your feet. Here, I'm not going to enter into the technical details because there are some special conditions that the soil needs to satisfy in order to be used. But with the appropriate chemical stabilization, using polymers, using cement, using lime, you can expand the combination of soils that can be used, really covering almost all of the territory in the world and the United States. Unless you are taking very material that is very rich in organic content, typically at the deltas of very large rivers, everything else is fair game and you can build houses. The important point to make is that these type of constructions are naturally resistant to almost everything you can throw at them. They can resist fire, they cannot be attacked by mold, fungi, rot, insects, pests, even with the appropriate covering and layering, they can be very resistant to flood, to tornadoes, to wind. So they are a very strong material and very cheap material. They are also a very healthy and natural material. They naturally produce walls that are breathable walls. They breathe, they are able to maintain the indoor humidity within the 40 and 60% that is the optimal condition for human usage. They do not produce any volatile organic compounds, so the air is particularly clean. They are eco-efficient, sustainable also from an energy point of view. Depending on the climate, you can get a 30 to 70% savings in heating and cooling by using this type of materials. and they have a smaller embodied energy than other construction materials like it is shown here. So they are sustainable. And they have a very good hazard resistance to different type of hazard if properly designed. We have done research supported by different agencies, including the National Science Foundation, in which we have demonstrated how to design structures that can resist to hurricane category 5, to tornadoes category 3, and to high seismic zones, even for two-story buildings. So we can make structures that are very resistant made with this material. Just to show you an example of how we produce these blocks, you can really make it with any shape you want, depending on the forms that you use. This is a machine that we have built in our lab. It's called the Simbaram. It's a mechanical compression machine that was developed in the 1960s in Southern America for building structures using earth. We recently bought a hydraulic Auran press that is shown here. This is making the work of our students a little bit less laborious. With the first machine, we can produce 20 to 30 blocks per hour, and we need very strong students. The second machine does everything hydraulically. We can produce about 300 blocks per hour with much less effort. Fundamentally, it's just the effort of pouring soil on top of the machine, and we even bought some elements to carry the soil in an easier way. These are some of the fabrication process steps that are needed, but you can really give any shape you want to these blocks and then use it and build houses using masonry techniques. We did obviously some preliminary studies. There are issues that are associated with any type of masonry construction, architectural issues, there are structural issues, and there are economical issues. And so we just tackle them one at a time. We developed first vernacular systems that were appropriate for different places. This is an example of a shotgun house that is appropriate for construction in towns like New Orleans, southern Louisiana. We did our research initially in southern Louisiana after Katrina, and based on the need of people for affordable housing after hurricane events. We did our investigation in terms of resistance to hurricanes and arrived to the design that is needed for sustaining hurricanes and tornadoes. Another issues that is well known with this type of materials is durability. And this is an example of a test that we ran outside of the LSU campus on a wall that was built using our material with a type of earth-based stucco that protects the wall to the effects of very strong storms typical of southern Louisiana. I guess one of the most interesting aspects is that by developing a technology based on interlocking blocks, mortarless masonry, we were actually able to reduce the cost of the wall and of the entire house to a value that was lower than an equivalent but much less resisting light framed wooden house, which is the typical technology that is used everywhere in Northern America and United States in particular. So we arrived to a point where we have a lot of confidence in the technology because we can build houses that people like, which is important. If people don't like the houses, no one will live in them. We can build houses that are with the appropriate strength, actually better than the one that we're building now with wood. And we can do it in a way that is economically feasible, actually cheaper than building with wood. We also needed a little bit more of technology to be able to describe the behavior of these structures because codes are very limited and the method of modeling typically used in structural engineering are also limited. So we developed the appropriate finite element technologies to be able to reproduce, as you can see, numerically, the behavior of experimental tests made with walls. So what I presented here is really our numerical simulation of the behavior of two experimentally tested walls that were nominally equal. So we are now also confident that we can represent the actual behavior of these structures in a way that allows us to do proper design. So now that we have all of this background ready, I'd like to connect it with the problem of wildfires, because that's why we are all here today. And one of the issues of wildfire, this is just some historical data from California that are showing how the issues in terms of losses and cost and life losses is really connected with the number of structures that are damaged or destroyed by the wildfires. The costs and life losses are much more correlated with the loss of structures than with the amount of acres that are burned by the wildfires, which means that we are observing wildfires that are getting more violent, and they're burning more wood, but fundamentally they are also destroying more houses. And this is a combination of hazard that is becoming worse due to climate change, but also to the fact that we are building more and more houses in places that are at higher risk of wildfire. And so we have a double whammy, because our risk is really given by the product of the hazard times the vulnerability. We are increasing both the hazard and the vulnerability at the same time. Fundamentally, that indicates we need to do something different than what we have done so far, because if we just try to adjust things on the edges, we are not going to handle the problem that we are really trying to fight. If we look at what is happening in terms of climate change, the image becomes even worse, because we see that the intensity of wildfires is really expected to increase more than 50%, even in a very short period of time. So it will be always more and more difficult to protect houses and built environment from wildfires. The typical approach that is used now, you have seen a different version of these figures on defensible space already from the previous presenters, but the point of representing it here is that right now, even the code, the compliant structures are really designed with the idea of being ignition resistant. Ignition resistant means that we hope they will survive long enough for the wildfire to go over and attack something else and leave the house as it is. But this requires two things. One is maintaining in a very good way the house and the defensible space, having houses that are practically covered with the elements that are not burning, and avoiding that houses around are going to burn for a very long period of time. And that's what Erica was saying, houses are burning much longer than wood, so that this flame doesn't reach your house, or the accumulation of embers doesn't arrive to a point where your house will burn. Houses that are made with burn are combustible themselves. So if you attack them for long enough, at the end they will seed and they will burn. So can we do something about it? What about building houses that are actually fire resistant, that do not burn? And that's where the earth block construction that was investigated previously for earthquakes, tornado, and hurricanes actually came up to be very useful. So this is just a little bit of showing off what our material can do when compared with the wood that is used for construction of a house. This is an earth block done with the soil of Paradise. We took the soil from the town of Paradise that was almost completely destroyed in the 2018 Camp Fire, to see if we can use that material to build new houses, because once a community is destroyed, you have to rebuild the houses. And right now, fundamentally we are rebuilding the same houses, which will fundamentally burn again whenever there is a new fire. And as you can see, wood will burn, but earth blocks will not. All you can see is a little bit of a change of a color. We did actually some mechanical and temperature tests on this material. Here you can see an example of a block as built and one after 7 hours subjected at 1800 Fahrenheit, which is pretty much the highest temperature that you can get in a fire, at least from vegetation. Probably you can reach even higher temperature when an house is burning. But in this case, the house is not burning, the material is not burning. So we did a little bit more investigation because we wanted to really understand what is happening to a house that is subjected to this temperature. What we did, we built some of these blocks. Again, the material was taken from Paradise, and then we subjected them at gradually increasing temperature from room temperature to 200, 400, 600, 800, and 1000 Celsius. So we're talking about 1800 Fahrenheit temperature. And then we tested them. This is what they look like after being immersed in this very high temperature. As you can see, they are actually changing their chemistry. Fundamentally, what is happening is that our unfired clay blocks are transforming under this high temperature gradually into fired clay blocks. So fundamentally, they're getting stronger. And this is really what we observed. First, we did the test in flexure that are showing that there is some micro cracking inside that produces failure in flexure, some brittleness with the increase in temperature. But if you test them in compression, what you find is that as they are subjected to higher temperature, they become stronger. So your house does not only not burn, but it becomes stronger when subjected to wildfires. Jumped one page, I don't know why. This is so true that actually we had to stop our testing because we started with a compression machine, and then the blocks that we were testing at higher temperature were so much stronger that we are recalibrating a new machine that is stronger than the original one because we were not able to break them, which I think is a very interesting and a positive message that we can provide here. Other considerations that are important. One is the issue of embodied energy. In a lot of research, when you compare light frame wooden houses with the other type of construction technologies, typically concrete block houses are considered as the element to compare it with when talking about wildfires. You find that they have much lower embodied energy and thus they are better from a point of view of climate change. However, that is true only if your house doesn't burn, because in the moment in which your house burns, what you get is practically the same level of embodied energy and the carbon emission as a concrete house, with the disadvantage that you don't have a house anymore and you have to rebuild it. So it's not really advantageous even from a climate change, a climate mitigation point of view. There are other considerations. I don't want to take too much of the time, but one of those that is very important is the emission of these houses. By not burning and protecting the content of the house, they also reduce a lot of the toxicity that is released by smoke and wildfires. We are actually working not only on the structural point of view analysis of these houses to allow structures that are going to be able to be re-inhabited after a wildfire, but also we are investigating what is the effect in terms of reducing the toxic emission and the carbon emissions under wildfire conditions at the level of the individual house and at the level of the community. So a little bit of a conclusions. The earth and masonry construction technology is an affordable, safe, and sustainable techniques that could be used for construction of houses that are wildfire resistant. I didn't discuss it before, but mainly the major issue is getting a permit because there are no codes really, or the codes that exist are very limited or limiting. And so getting a permit is usually a very expensive process. And that makes these houses much more expensive than the wooded houses, unfortunately, not because the house is more expensive, but because the permit process is more expensive. We are developing affordable fire-resistant construction techniques that are based on this technology. They also have a great potential to address climate change and equitable economic development because they reduce the cost of construction and they use local materials and local labor, and thus they actually help the local economy. We are focusing on wildfire resilience and mitigation of wildfire smoke emissions, which is another component of that is very important in protecting houses from wildfires. I need to acknowledge all of the funding agencies and the collaborators that worked on this. I'm not going to read them, but you can see it's not a one-person work. It takes a village to do this. And then thank you very much, and I'll be able to happy to respond to any question you may have after the other colleagues have finished their presentation. I'm also leaving here my contact information, but it's very easy to find me. So if you have any question even after this meeting, you know where to find me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And last but not least, Kelly. Can't see you on here, but I know you're here. There you are. Okay.
I'm just going to try and share my screen here.
Awesome.
And that should be it there. How does that look?
We can see it.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So my name's Kelly Johnston. I'm the operations manager from the Community Wildfire Planning Center, just for those that joined after we did the introductions. And we're, full disclosure, we're actually doing work supporting the town of Superior in the rebuild with regards to trying to rebuild with more fire resilient building requirements. So all of the stuff that many of the presenters just talked about, we're working on that at this moment. Right in the middle of that, so I've kind of taken this presentation to we'll relate it to what is to the outcomes of the fire, but there's no specifics with regards to Superior here. And there we go. So what I'm going to talk about is more about how land use planning can really support wildfire resiliency. And so when we look at the fire adapted communities, the whole fire adapted communities program, there's a whole bunch of components to that that include Firewise and Ready, Set, Go, and many of the other components. But we're really focused on the land use planning component. And we're going to back right out to the community level. We've had a lot of focus specific to the home ignition zone or the structure ignition zone, which we've included, but we're going to back out to the community level. And this actually touches on something that Jim brought up in his presentation is really one of the first things we need to do is define what the wildland urban interface is. And as you saw on Jim's map, there has been a definition for a number of years for Boulder County, and now there's some thought of, okay, after this incident, maybe we need to do something a little different or look at things. And so I'm offering this definition of the wildland urban interface that describes any developed area where conditions affecting the combustibility of natural and cultivated vegetation, and we'll call those wildland fuels, and the structures or infrastructure, and we'll call those built fuels. And if you'll remember, Jim really spoke on, the fact that the houses are fuels too. And so this allows for the ignition and spread of fire through that combined fuel complex, which is also a really, which is another key concept, that we're not just dealing with wildland fuels, and we're not just dealing with urban fuels. We're dealing with a combined complex of fuels, and the word complex is because they're complex. But when we're actually, so now that we've identified the wildland urban interface, really we have to kind of quantify or delineate the risks that we're actually facing. And you know, we heard again from some of the presenters that really the risk that we're facing is much larger than just losing homes. That we lose the homes, and that's what I've called in here a first order effect. It's one of the first order effects of losing structures. But there's a whole bunch of other secondary effects that come from that, like the economic impacts, the social impacts, the health impacts, the actual environmental fire effects, the chemicals that are released, and all sorts of things. And then of course the compounding natural hazards of first there's fire, then typically there's flood, and the fire has made the floods worse. So when we look at the risk, we're really looking at the likelihood of the fire occurring, and the intensity, what kind of flames we're going to see, or threat or exposure to the community, and in the susceptibility of the community. And so we're really focusing on the susceptibility piece, which is, what are those flames going to do when they get to the community, and not just the flames, but the embers as well. And I just wanted to throw a special note in is, ironically, when we see events like this, like the Marshall Fire, like the Paradise Fire, like all these large fires, if you look the day before these fires, and you looked at the probability of these fires occurring to the extent they did and the damage that occurred, they would be probably sitting in the less than 1% probability realm of actually occurring. So we're designing our response much like this webinar that we're on, because we've experienced a high consequence but low probability event. So we really should be looking at the risk, not just looking at the low probability events, but not just looking at the high probability events, but also looking at the low probability, what could possibly happen even at a low probability, because the disasters that we're seeing are exactly those. So starting from that community level, we want to look at the site design and layout, and we heard that there's some research being done on structure separation and where they sit and what they do and how they're related to each other. And there's really, as at this point, there's a lot of the research kind of goes both ways. High density communities, or communities that are spread out, they offer their own risks, and then of course the road layouts and everything else that's in there. So really, if we can start right back from the beginning and say, well, how are we going to design the community so that's more resilient, just even in the lot layouts and the road layouts. And that leads us to ensuring that we have adequate access and egress. So access for fire suppression, safe response of fire suppression responders, and safe egress of people trying to evacuate. And then of course, with the idea of that, fire could come from many different directions, so we should have multiple accesses and multiple egress routes to try and facilitate that and anticipate that one area or more than one area would be impacted and is impassable. The second part to this is also having a sustainable water supply during these events. Not only do we have our fire flow water supply that is part of our municipal systems, or some other system, that well systems or some other system that supports the fire response, we have to make sure that sustains itself through the event. And typically we have things like power loss that occurs right away, and many of our pumping systems for our municipal water supplies relies on power. So having backup power, anticipating power loss, and or having direct having mitigation of the water infrastructure itself for loss from direct impacts of fire. This is one that you know, played, as we heard earlier, played a pretty large role in the Marshall Fire. Was, you know, the extensive grassland open space where the fire traveled through. You know, and really, you know, there's a lot of thought about, well, how do you manage the open space? How do you manage grasslands in the forest field types, as Jim alluded to, and as we heard, that are, you know, we typically manage in these wildland urban interface areas. We have some pretty good best practices that we you know, we thin some trees out, we reduce surface fuel, and we prune the tree crown bases up so that the fire can't transition into crown fire. But when we look at grass fuel types, we're looking at, you know, we're challenged with many things. First of all, we're dealing with an ecosystem that's highly vulnerable, and we have a lot of species that are dependent on the native or natural grasslands. So things like going and mowing these grasslands on a regular basis, or just, you know, changing them significantly, can have a lot of negative impacts. And if we look at how the grasslands burn, they typically burn frequently with low intensity. And so when we're talking about how we can design a community, we're actually not dealing with the same heat exposures that we're dealing with the forest. We're also not dealing with specifically with the same ember transport distances that we're dealing with the forest. We're dealing with a much lighter fuel that has smaller embers that burn out a lot quicker, and can't sustain ignition through long distances of transport. What we are dealing with is a very fast moving fire that's very difficult to keep up with. And therefore, you know, firefighters typically cannot get in front of a grass fire before it gets to our communities. So the communities do have to be resilient in regards to that type of fuel. And that brings us to, well, in the open space, what we can do is provide better access and maybe more safe areas so that we can provide more opportunities of control lines in the fuel type. And then what we really have to look at is setbacks, and making sure that those native grasslands that are typically longer and not irrigated are set back from our actual communities somehow, or our communities are set back with them with a little bit of a buffer, so that those flame links that we see from the grass and the embers can't extend into the community so easily. This is actually a photo from the Waldo Canyon fire, where the IBHS research showed that the setbacks in some of the green spaces were pretty significant with regards to had a significant role in whether a home survived or not. So I won't touch. We've heard a lot about the structure ignition zone or the home ignition zone. Historically, we've called it the home ignition zone. The NFPA has changed it to the structure ignition zone to encompass not just homes, but other structures. And we looked at we're really looking at the condition of the structure itself, and then of course the defensible space extending out to 100 feet, or if we've got topography even further. And then the importance of that zone one, and the having that non-combustible zone one space next to the structure, as well as the treatment of the fuels as we move out. So starting at the building materials, we've heard some very interesting information on some potential future building materials. Jim shared some of the building materials that Wildfire Partners focuses on, but really there are already a number of building material options that have through case studies and through testing have met some best practices requirements for wildfire resistance. Particularly, there's vents out there. We know that non-combustible gutters and downspouts offer increased protection. We know that cement fiber wall cladding offers increased protection. Multi-pane windows or tempered glass windows. Class A roof coverings, which Class A roof coverings, ironically, are pretty much the, if we have composite shingle roofs, are pretty much the cheapest roofs you can put on a house at this point. And so we do have a lot of options now, and those are expressed in many codes and standards that are out there. And then again, the landscaping and ensuring that the landscaping isn't receptive to generating higher intensity fire close into the building. And Jim shared the importance of that 5-foot zone immediately adjacent to the building itself. Moving to development density, you can see that when we look at that structure ignition zone that, and Jim shared this, that you've got, if you have a denser community, you've got significant overlap, and therefore you're extremely reliant on your neighbor and the adjacent homes as far as protecting your own home. If the homes are spread out further, you have more control over your structure ignition zone. But from a fire response perspective, it takes more resources to try and protect the homes that are further spread out. With the homes are closer together, you know, one engine or one piece of apparatus can provide protection for multiple homes. So there's gives and takes on both, and the research is still really out as far as, you know, if the homes are both adequately protected, what's the best density? We know from sustainability that density is increasing, that we want density to increase to try and reduce our footprints, and we can align with that. There is the possibility to plan and align with increased density as long as we have other components in place. These are examples of a high density wildland urban interface neighborhood on the left-hand side, and in the lower density urban intermix of the Black Forest fire on the right-hand side. You know, there's home losses in both. As I said, on the right-hand side, the lower density, you can have increased control over your space, but the home ignition zone or the structure ignition zone still has to be properly mitigated. And on the left-hand side, less control over your own space because it extends into the neighboring parcels. But with appropriate mitigations of communities like this, you can still can achieve success. Just a quick touch on a couple of other things is we also have to consider things like hazardous lands, so lands that generate or can propagate fire more or increase the hazard. And then of course the vulnerable land uses like hospitals or care homes or neighborhoods that contain higher vulnerability populations. They're going to take more of an effort to try and protect those people and more resources. And of course, the hazardous lands. In really, when you're starting to talk about those land uses and zoning and where to put these things, being aware of making sure that the hazardous land uses are in places that they're not going to cause any immediate impact on areas that are going to be difficult to mitigate as far as the populations. So there's a lot of tools to integrate into land use planning for wildfire resiliency. The master plan or the comprehensive plan, you know, typically that's the first place to start. That's the one that drives, that's the one that typically drives everything that happens in a community and all of the other plans below that. that quickly relates to the community wildfire plan. So having policies and goals and objectives in the comprehensive plan that relate to wildfire, and particular hand off the sort of where the rubber hits the road in the community wildfire protection plan. Maintaining a connection between these plans and the local hazard mitigation plan, and then moving down into the actual codes themselves, the relationship between the building code, the fire code, and a wildland urban interface code. These can also translate into how they relate to things like subdivision regulations and the requirements for subdivisions like access, egress, water supply, vegetation management. And then finally, the overarching zoning and land development code to ensure that the appropriate land use is in the appropriate place to help support the wildfire mitigation throughout a community. And so there's a lot of resources for that. Two of the primary organizations that offer this type of information are the International Codes Council. They have the International Building Code, the Fire Code, the International Wildland Urban Interface Code, and then the NFPA that offers the standards that can be integrated into codes. So there was the 1141, 42, and 44 that all relate to community design, water supply, and the home ignition zone. Now the 1141 and 44 have combined into an 1140 standard, and the 1142 is still on its own. But they're available from the NFPA, or as I said, the International Codes Council. So at the CWPC, we've done some work that focuses on land use planning approaches and the wildland urban interface. A recent publication that were released last winter was the land use planning approaches in the wildland urban interface for over 4 Western states, including Colorado. And specific to Colorado, what we did was we actually looked at we started off by looking at how many county master plans in Colorado included reference to wildfire. And we split it up into extensive, limited, none, or no master plan available. And so what we found was 42% of the counties in Colorado actually had extensive reference to wildland urban interface. 17% had limited reference to wildland interface. 25% had no reference, and there were some counties that had no master plan or comprehensive plan in place. So you can see that there's even some room for getting some wins just starting at our master plans or our comprehensive plans here. So some of the challenges that present ourselves for moving forward with the land use planning is, well, we heard about that with Jim, is what do we identify as the wildland urban interface? With the changing world, with climate change and the areas that, and based on the definition that I suggested, we obviously can't necessarily paint everything as the wildland urban interface. That might be unrealistic. It would create a gigantic job for us to do, but maybe more. And the Marshall Fire is one of those examples of maybe we need to take another look at what we're classifying as the wildland urban interface. There are a number of legislative barriers and gaps that exist in some of the states and including Colorado that don't allow local governments to implement some of the things that should be implemented or limit their land use planning approaches with regards to wildland fire. And then of course, we've talked about there's a high demand on housing. There's a high demand on affordable housing. There's exponential growth in many areas, and there's no sign of that cooling off in the short term. And so, we have a housing shortage and an affordable housing challenge that we have to meet. And then of course, we want to make sure that the legislation that's put in place is appropriate. And sometimes in situations, most of the legislation that's applied is reactionary because of events like this. And maybe we should start looking at this as more of a proactive approach, so that we can get ahead of the curve. And then finally, we have, it's a new thing. The wildland urban interface is really there's a group of people on this call, and there's a group of people throughout the country that spend their entire careers looking at what they can do to increase resiliency in the wildland urban interface. But with that compared to the growth and the planning and the communities extended across the country, there's not enough planning expertise to undertake these tasks. And so that there needs to be a growth in the planning expertise for land use planners that have enough of a knowledge of wildfire and the wildland urban interface to be able to incorporate that into their planning decisions. So some solutions. First of all, rethink how we define the wildland urban interface. Require wildfire policies in county master plans. I know that people don't necessarily like to hear about California, but in their general plans, they do have a state requirement that in the safety element that you have to address wildfire. And then of course, developing and providing technical assistance to increase the capacity. So things like model codes, resources, trainings, online libraries. This is why we created the Community Wildfire Planning Center, was to try and help fill this void of offering specific land use training and resources to the land use planning community. And then of course, supporting programs like Wildfire Partners to address existing development. It works. The proof is in the pudding, and the program that Jim put together is a program that's we at the CWPC are helping to try and replicate in other areas of the state and across Canada and in other states. And then of course, transfer I think we talked about this right at the beginning, maybe before we started this presentation, but transferring the lessons that we've learned from other hazard mitigation like flooding. Is there things we can learn from that we've already learned that we can transfer to wildfire, so we don't have to recreate the wheel? That's all I have to offer for now, except for we do have some resources out there. Molly and myself and a few others put together a document for the American Planning Association called Planning the Wildland Urban Interface, and it's free to download in a PDF off of the APA website. And then of course our land use planning approach in the wildland urban interface. That's available. Both of these you can find links on our website, communitywildfire.org. And you can look forward to more tools that we're working on to help land use planners plan for wildfire. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate it, and appreciate all the presenters here tonight. We are a little bit over time, but hopefully the presenters could stay to answer a couple questions. If anybody has one, please go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it. And we'll just get a couple questions in if there are any.
Hi, Steve Orr, City of Boulder resident, wildfire mitigation enthusiast. Thanks everyone, first of all. Mostly question for Jim, but you might get into Kelly a little bit at the end. As you think about expanding the Wildfire Partners program potentially into Fire Zone number 2, the Plains, when we think about the City of Boulder, they have an existing home assessment program. I don't believe it's quite the same as what Partners uses. So could you talk a little bit about that, or has there been any discussion with the city to tweak or maybe utilize the Wildfire Partners program for consistency? And then of course, potentially if we need to share resources across boundaries to get inspections or assessments done, would that be a best practice potentially? And the reason, Kelly, just also, I know Kelly, you've talked about the more of a statewide program or a program that could be replicated elsewhere. So yeah, if Jim or Kelly could talk about that, it'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, Steve. We're talking about it on a daily basis here. Post-Marshall Fire just got off the phone before this webinar with the Office of Emergency Management that functions for both the city of Boulder and Boulder County. Been talking to the city of Louisville and the different fire districts. You know, it's an organizational challenge. In the foothills and mountains, the towns of Netherland, Ward, Jamestown, and Lyons are smaller entities, and we've included them in our programs. On the plains, it's a little different dynamics. The city of Boulder is a large entity. City of Longmont and unincorporated Boulder County is a little smaller in terms of number of homes under our jurisdiction. So, you know, it's possible that we'll be coordinating, you know, with multiple municipalities and all working together. That has benefits. We'll see. It depends in part on capacity and funding. But when you start some new efforts, you know, in Louisville or some other programs, you know, starting from scratch is easier than changing things. So the city of Boulder does have a program, and we've coordinated with the city of Boulder over the years, and we've shared our experience with Wildfire Partners, and they've built upon that. And so we work closely together. And they're in the fire department, we're in a county department, so we're structured slightly differently. But there's lots of opportunities to coordinate. But right now we're both understaffed in the sense of the city of Boulder has a long waiting list for their assessment program, and we have a long waiting list for ours. So it's a question of partly of capacity.
Thank you.
And I think, Steve, you know, and Jim can chime in, but I'll make it short. All of us, we've been working together for a while in trying to expand the Wildfire Partners type program, and, you know, with consistency so that it's, you know, it's a consistent and industry standard type program, hopefully, you know, to the state level so that it can be available to anyone. So.
Thank you.
Amelia, would you like to go ahead and ask your question? Oh, you're muted.
Does it make sense? I live in a neighborhood with houses with siding, and my house is over 50 years old. Does it make sense to put an adobe finish over the siding?
Yes, I can take that one.
Could someone answer that?
Yes. So generally, any type of fire retardant or fire resistant siding will help the survivability of your house. It doesn't need necessarily to be adobe, but it can be adobe. Adobe is a relatively heavy material because is thought of mainly as a structural material, but is a very viable solution. You can probably obtain similar results with a coating of soil and lime, or with other lighter materials. There is obviously the aspect of adobe that is very pleasant to the view, which is a possible consideration. But from a purely functional point of view, it is feasible, it can make sense. It just needs to be checked if it makes sense also from an economic point of view, because it would be relatively expensive to actually have an adobe layer as a protection, because it could work as a wall by itself.
Okay.
Also add in that there's a lot of prescriptive kind of checklists for wildfire mitigation. And I know a lot of communities are trying to sleuth out, how do we make this specific to the property that we're talking about? So from digging through decades of wildfire research, what we found is that if you have defensible space coupled with a non-combustible roof, those two partnered together are actually really effective. And you have, like, we're trying to prevent the fire from getting inside the home. So, like making sure your windows, so if you have, this non-combustible siding, but you have older windows that will break in a fire, then it doesn't really matter if you have non-combustible siding, because the fire is still going to get into the house. So I would, recommend checking out a lot of the information that's on the NFPA FireWise website and the Communities in Fire Planning program that Kelly's a part of. Because they have a bit more information that so you can figure out what's the best for your property, and what the best course of action is based on the layout of your neighborhood.
Okay.
Anyone have any other questions? It looks like David and Bart, a lot of your questions were answered in the chat, but if you wanted to go ahead and ask anything else, please do. I know there were a couple that weren't answered. All right, maybe everybody's ready to call it a day. Well, thank you so much to all the presenters and also everybody else for being here tonight. And Kirk Vincent, one last question and then we'll wrap it up and everyone can go have dinner.
Yeah, hi, it's really a comment.
Yeah.
I watched the city council's meeting last Tuesday, and half of it was talking with the emergency management in the county and the Boulder fire and rescue chief. So the city and the fire department are taking the Marshall Fire very seriously, and they're top-notch groups. So I want to be positive in that way. But we do have challenges, and one of the things that the fire chief was talking about is, well, how far in from the edge of town is the urban interface? And that means something to me, because I live 2.5 blocks from Chautauqua Meadow and the hill slope beneath Flagstaff Mountain and the Star. So Upper University Hill, Uni Hill's the 3rd oldest neighborhood in town. And so I walked around and today, and of 50 homes between me and Chautauqua Meadow, 45% were masonry, the lower floor, or 45% were wood. So the remainder are masonry. So some of the old neighborhoods, there's a lot of masonry buildings, which is good, because rumor has it Boulder burned down 3 times, before statehood. But the thing that really struck me was that 65% of the properties had a wooden fence on 3 sides of the perimeter, and more than 90% of the properties had a wood fence on 1 side, at least. So, the council was talking about wood siding, but the thing that strikes me is there's so goddamn many wood fences in Boulder. So that's maybe a more financially feasible way to start. So thank you.
Thanks, Kirk. Yeah, really good observations. And I think all of us are so much more aware now when we're walking through neighborhoods and seeing all of these different components and, just a different awareness now about things, which is great, really, that we can continue learning from all of this. So, okay, thanks so much. We will be emailing out a link to the recording, and we will also have a list of some of the references that were mentioned here today. And we'll send out presentations too. If you guys could email your presentations to Erin, that would be Awesome. So thanks so much, everybody, and have a good rest of your night.